When I was 50 years old, my brother Kirk wrote me a letter. There are 5 Graham siblings. We all have 4-letter names, except for my sister Nancy, because my parents wanted to be able to yell us all quick and loudly. And my brother Kirk wrote me a letter on my 50th birthday, and he said, "I know what you did," which is disturbing because your siblings do know things about you. And he said, on our birthdays, we all would get to choose our own meal. My mom would make whatever meal we wanted. For the first umpteen years of my life, mine was hamburger pie, which was basically a hamburger and tomato sauce filling with Bisquick on top. I thought it was great. My mom liked it too because it wasn't too much work. And I know Kirk had hamburgers. Now, Nelson, bless his heart, had peanut butter sandwiches for a long time. I don't remember what the other two had, but we got our birthday dinner. And you could change it. You could make your request as long as it wasn't too demanding. But Kirk said, "I know what you did," because when I was about 14, I think my parents, I don't remember the circumstances, but we all went out to a Chinese restaurant. Everybody hated it, kids. Well, my parents liked it. I thought it was okay. But after that, on my birthday, he said, I noticed you always asked to go out for Chinese. And he said, "Here's what you got for that." Because your siblings would all go, "I'm not going out for Chinese." And so you and mom and dad would go out, and you would get to spend a couple hours with mom and dad all by yourself at a restaurant. And he said, and furthermore, since none of us would go, he said they would say, "Why don't you bring a friend?" He said, "So you had a good time the entire time. I ate my hamburgers and canned corn at home, but you every year got to go out with mom and dad and have some quality time with them with a good friend from school." He said, "You gamed the system." Well, I don't know if you're aware of it because you've heard so many nice things, but that's what the women did to you last week. The women gamed the system. They went into closed rooms and planned this thing for 2.5 years. And they never said, "No men at our meeting." We were always welcome. And they would go back there and we would look and we'd say, "Let's see, meeting with a room full of women or buffalo chicken dip and Glenn's cheesecake? Which one am I going to pick?" And as we would fill our plates, the door to the conference room would softly close. And the women would have their meetings. And here's the content of their meetings. I'm figuring this out. I didn't hear the meetings, but I figured this out in retrospect. They said, if we work the word enrichment into this weekend, we can pretty much get away with anything. The men will let us do whatever we want if we call it a women's enrichment weekend. And people said, "Really, you think we can do that?" And somebody said, "They really aren't all that bright. I think we can do this." And then they proceeded to plan it, and they decked it out with the trappings of wonderful things like quilts and food and flowers and seminars and things like that. But when I got there, it was a great event, and Mark Scapura and I were off to the sidelines some of the time, and we aren't the quickest people in the world, but after a while, we realized these people were having a very good time. And they might not have told you about the wine that flowed freely on Friday night. I saw it. They might not have told you about the beautiful hors d'oeuvres and the hospitality and the conversations and the free time that they had. They might not have told you, talk about scandal, that at the very tables where people sat and listened to Sabbath services, there was chocolate strewn across the tables. I saw it with my own eyes. All right, I tasted it with my own taste buds. They were having a really good time without you while you had your Little Debbie's and beef jerky here last week. They were having an absolutely wonderful time. And Mark Skipper and I kind of said afterwards, he said, think we could pull this off? And we both went, nope, there's no way. There's no way we could do this because we'd have to get the women to help us. They know a good thing, They call it the Women's Enrichment Weekend, and honestly, it was just an absolutely wonderful experience. I was privileged to be able to walk into the room, and they never said, and then please leave afterwards. But we got the message, There were men there the entire time, but it was a women's event, and it was. I don't have to say much about it because you've seen the slideshow. Taya listened to the seminars on Zoom, every one of them that came through on Zoom, and they were very impressive. Most of them were women telling heartfelt stories and what they had meant to them as a child of God and how it would help other people. And there was, of course, a garden theme. It was a wonderful event. I'm sure BJ is thinking right now, and we won't do it again for years here, But it really was. And I just echo the hats off to everybody because it was a fantastic event. I couldn't help noticing, and it's just a fact of life in our church, that in general, there were all ages represented, but it was a fairly gray event. And by gray, I mean, many of the women color their hair. Some of the women even color their hair gray these days, but there was a lot of the homegrown organic stuff there too, of gray hair. These people had earned it, and these were experienced people who had faced challenges in their God-driven lives and had met them and were sharing how they had done it and hoped to inspire other people. But one of the things that I listened to and made me think, and it was just a fringe event that happened there because there were all kinds of conversations going on, was I was sitting talking, what do I call her, our in-laws? My son-in-law's mother was there, and she needs to sit, and we were having a conversation, and there were a number of other women standing around, and the conversation quickly changed to the times and experiences they shared in Pasadena during the Worldwide Church of God days. So these were women who go back in our church history a bit. Not everybody, but it made me think. They were talking about a lot of good things and how they met so many people and how much it meant to them even in this day and age when that kind of thing is long past. And I'm always asking myself, as are many of us, because we go, we call our church life, our life as a child of God, we call it a journey. We're always moving. Tempting as the recliner is, I need to get up and I need to do things. There's always new directions to go. And I'm always asking myself, and I'm not alone in this, I've heard Mr. Kubik ask these questions and members of the council. I'm always asking, where have we been? Where are we going? What has to happen? And what can we do to hasten the day? Now, one of the hazards and pits of getting to be up in years is that there's this force in life called nostalgia. And often you can spend a lot of time looking backwards. And there's benefits to that. You can analyze things and be appreciative of what's gone on. I notice this is 2022, 50 years ago in 1972, 4 other young men and I, and we were all young in those days, we got a house, and it was on Beckwith Avenue. We were all part of the forestry school at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana, and we were known as the Beckwith Boys. And we were under suspicion a lot of the time because we had a good time. We cooked and we gardened and we hunted and we had our meat locker and we painted the house and we built in an additional bedroom so we could have another roommate. And the forestry school didn't know quite what to think of us. And I remember one day we were 2 blocks away from the university, and the 5 of us we all happened to be walking that day together. Usually our schedules didn't coincide quite that well, but we're walking to the forestry school on a crisp autumn day, and we saw other forestry students across the street, and they were looking at us. And we were being observed, and we knew that that we were suspicious people. And the oldest, Fred, who was our ringleader, and we would do anything Fred said, he said, on the count of three, we're all going to skip the rest of the way. 1, 2, 3. And we skipped the rest of the 2 blocks to the University of Montana Forestry School. And if our reputation hadn't been made before that day, it was made that day and long thereafter. But we had a good time. But what I noticed is that I'm the type of person, I've always stayed in touch with all these people. One of them, most of them are still out west. One of them happens to live in Pittsburgh. But the other guys, now that 50 years have gone by, they're getting very nostalgic. They're getting quite sentimental about things in ways that aren't characteristic. And I laugh because I've been sentimental the entire time. I've always remembered back. But it's something that people do. And it can be a pitfall. You don't want to get caught up in it because you have to keep looking forward. But it made me think about the time that I was blessed to spend in Pasadena, California, when it was the headquarters, and that's what we called it, of God's work. And that's what it was. And there was good and bad in those times. There were many wonderful things. We're still here. And there were suspicious things. There were undercurrents of all kinds of things. And you know the history, but the fact is there were many good things that actually happened. And no matter what you think about the character of the people involved, it's good to know our church history and the things that actually happened. And they're quite astounding when you go back. I was looking through my archives, and with every move, my archives get smaller. But that's what I was unloading here, my archives from those days, the evidence that it actually happened, because we've lived in Ohio since 1978, and I sometimes wonder if we ever lived in California. But we did. And we had the opportunity, both Taya and I, we actually, she was there a year before I was, came up to Montana and we met, and we actually got married down there a couple years later after that. But it makes me think of where have we been and what does it mean for today and what still has to happen and how can we use that information to hasten the day. And I would like to call your attention to the book in the Bible of Festus. The Book of Festus, if you will please turn to the Book of Festus. And you're saying, what are we, Gunsmoke these days? But there is a book in the Bible that's named after a man, and the man's name means feasts. The root of his name means feast, and that's why I said Festus, because that would be the equivalent in our world. But you remember, have you ever heard people say Chag Sameach? I can't get the part right, but the Chag part became part of the name of a man named Haggai. So if you'll please turn to the book of Haggai, and it's easy to find because the last book in the Old Testament is Malachi, and right before that is Zechariah, and right before that, on a page or two, is the book of Haggai. And Haggai, as I said, his mama named him after feast days. It would be like you name your kid Tabernacles or something. He'd have a rough time in elementary school, but eventually he would grow up into it, and maybe he could go by Tab, because it sure beats Knackles, doesn't it? But Haggai grew up being Festus. He was feast, and he's actually telling the story here he's telling what God said at that time, and this is after Israel had gone into captivity, and I should say Judah had gone into captivity, and they had returned to Jerusalem under miraculous circumstances. It was their headquarters. They had gone back to headquarters, and it's a story about Zerubbabel and Jeshua. And they were real, live, historical people. So there are 2 levels to read this on. One, that God is telling them to rebuild the temple, or actually the Hebrew word just means house, to build the house. That's what they had to do at that point. And as you know from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, they had quite a struggle to do that. And in the first chapter, which we won't spend a lot of time on, God's saying, well, people are saying it's not time. He said, but I'm telling you it's time. Build the house. I brought you here by a miracle, and that's what you have to do. And he said, things aren't going so well for you now, but if you put your efforts into building the house, you will find that I will bless you, bless you, bless you. And then it says at the end of chapter 1, starting in verse 13, then Haggai, the Lord's messenger, gave this message of the Lord to the people, I am with you, declares the Lord. So the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the whole remnant of the people. They came and began to work on the house of the Lord Almighty their God. So they did their part. And then chapter 2 is what I want to focus on. Then, a little while later, more words straight from God came to the prophet Haggai. Can you imagine being privileged to live in a time when someone heard directly from God and gave his words to you? I mean, now we feel that we hear from God, we pray to God, and God gives us answers in his own way, but this was with actual words that could be repeated. It was an actual message that God gave to Festus, to Haggai. And God says, speak to Zerubbabel and to Joshua and to the remnant of the people. So there's three parties here. There's the two men, but the people are very important. And ask them, verse 3, who of you is left who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem to you like nothing? But be strong, Zerubbabel, be strong, Joshua, be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt. And that was literal, because these people did come out of Egypt. But for us, it's literal in a symbolic way, because this also applies to our lives today. And of course, we have all come out of Egypt, and we will flog that metaphor to death in the holy days coming up, and I don't mean anything bad by that. I mean, it has a lot to do with our spiritual journey. So it was literal for their people, but it wasn't literal for these exact people. Matter of fact, they had just come out of Babylon, if you want to be literal. So in all cases, it was God saying that he had delivered them from slavery. And then he said, and my spirit remains among you, which is the title of this message today. My spirit remains among you. And he says, do not fear. This is what the Lord Almighty says. And this is an important verse because this links us to the book of Hebrews. And by that, we know that he's talking about end time things here. This was a real story, yes, but we also know that there's symbolism involved. And to make a long story short, Zerubbabel and Jeshua are types of people who will come again, who will rise again. God will use people to build a house in his end time. It hasn't happened yet, and frankly, we don't know a lot of facts about it. We believe that it will happen, and when it happens, we'll be armed. But we really, anything beyond that is kind of speculation. But this is an important verse because it links us to verses in the New Testament that absolutely say this is for the end times, and we'll get to that. Verse 6, this is what the Lord Almighty says, in a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all nations, and the desired of all nations will come. And that's people, the elect. People will travel there. And I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace. And that peace word is shalom, with all the meanings that it has. It's hard to translate it. It means so much more than peace, but it means every good thing, really. And that comes directly from God. And of course, he talks about other things. But what he has said is there are people alive today who saw the house in its former glory. And yet, you people will see even greater works to come. And that applies to our day today because there are many people, there were many people at the Women's Weekend who did have experiences with either Pasadena or Big Sandy or Bricket Wood, because we had three, we called them college campuses, but they were so much more than that. They were places where we sent our treasures. And by that I mean we sent our children. We also sent them money so that they could build incredibly beautiful buildings and so that they could be a shining city on a hill and that they could light the way for the rest of the world. And so I'd like to go back and talk about those things because there are people alive who have seen the former glory, and yet there is more to come. And I think it's important to see the big picture. So what did exist in those days? Well, anything I say
will not tell the story. It's like the Queen of Sheba. When you showed up, you couldn't believe it. And God, talks about the silver is mine and the gold is mine. And we didn't like to talk about money and where all the money came from, but there was money there. There was money to spend. There were buildings. There were gardens, there was agriculture, there was music, there was arts, there were world leaders who were involved in our work. I should acknowledge from the very beginning that the work was headed by a human named Herbert W. Armstrong. And of course we say it's the Church of Jesus Christ, and that's accurate, but we had and continue to have human leaders. And the human leader was Herbert W. Armstrong, and you can argue all you want about his character and how good he was and how sincere he was, but none of that matters today for this purpose, because all I'm going to talk about is what he actually did and what can be actually backed up, and it's all facts, and it's not something that you can argue with. Talking about what he accomplished, and there were the 3 college campuses, but that doesn't tell the whole story, because we also presented music and the arts to the world. You can say, and people do say, oh, well, we bought our way into audiences with world leaders. Well, have you ever tried it? I mean, can you buy your way into Queen Elizabeth's sitting room and talk to her? Can you do that? No, you can't do that unless the doors somehow open. And sometimes they open with money in the form of charitable donations to private enterprises that these people were interested in, and it opened doors. And one of the reasons we have this work in the Philippines that Mr. Thomas refers to is because we had major campaigns in public done there, and they were done with the blessing of the leaders of that day. All right, he was a dictator named Marcos, and he was deposed later. But you work with what you got, that he was the Philippine leader at that point, and they were in the same room, and they talked to each other, and amazing things were set up. In that time, we had I know that the total of our feast attendance was more than 150,000 per year. I don't know what our membership was, because that would be baptized people. I'm sure that's available, but I just remember the figure that there were 150,000 people at the feasts. And if you went to a nice, intimate, small feast, like Dayton, there would only be like 2,500 people or something. Those were the little ones where you got to know everybody. And if you wanted to go to St. Petersburg, there'd be 18,000, or Tucson, there'd be thousands and thousands of people. It was a different time. We were on the radio, we were on TV. There were 382 TV stations in the United States that we were on. There were more international, and what's the right word? Unbiased observers will point out that this was more than Billy Graham had. It was more than Jerry Falwell had. It was more than, who were those awful people? The Bakers, Tammy Faye and Jim Baker. But they were all dwarfed in comparison. The Plain Truth was published in 7 languages with 8.2 million monthly circulation, and in the year that's from, 1986, Time magazine had a monthly circulation of 5.9 million. I remember a political cartoon that involved the Plain Truth magazine in those days. I don't have the cartoon. I remember it wasn't favorable. They didn't like the Plain Truth. But I looked at that cartoon and I thought, they know about the Plain Truth. They don't like us, but they know about us, and that's a beginning. We can work with that. And if you said Plain Truth magazine, people knew what you were talking about. Well, I have some archives from those days, and I'll put them up here. I think the Thomases have way more than I have, because mine has gotten smaller and smaller. But the star of the show is the 1969 Envoy, the yearbook that was put out, and this was at a time when we had 3 campuses, and you cannot believe the beauty and the splendor of these places, and the plans for the future, and the buildings and people would see those gardens in Pasadena. That's where we got married for free, because we lived out there, and they let us get married in these beautiful gardens. All we had to do was reserve it. That's the way it was. People came from far and wide just to see the gardens at that point. So if you'd like to look at this book. I don't mean this exact copy, but the 1969 envoy convinced many people to be part of this work. And that's one of the reasons that they made this book so heavy, is it's full of pictures and beautiful things and shows the splendor of our 3 campuses. And the reason isn't to show we have splendor, it's to show that there's a work being done, and this is what's behind it. I also happen to have this booklet from the old days, The 7 Laws of Success. This isn't a vintage booklet. This isn't the beginning printing, but our work was kind of built on that at that point. It was very important. And I have some other publications here that are just kind of random, but they meant something to my wife or me. This is the Faculty Dining Guide, which is just incredible. The Women's Weekend wasn't this complicated, but students had to serve, and so I think Taya, Taya served in the faculty dining room, and that's why she has that. I have the campus tour manual of the Bricket Wood campus in England, which was wonderful. I have a Feast of Tabernacles edition of the Good News, and this has a photo in it of my mother-in-law. She was baptized just a few years before she died, but it shows her rejoicing at the feast. And there's something about these magazines that you don't get to enjoy today, but the people who've been around a while will know what I mean. Today, when you get a Beyond Today, and you see a picture of a family, and it says, Shutterstock photos, and they're nice photos, and we use them, and we pay for them, and there's no copyright problems. Well, when we used to get a Plain Truth or a Good News at our house, at least those of us who'd been in Pasadena, but also other people, the first thing we would do was we would look at the pictures and see how many people we knew, because they were people we knew. And we had a little variation on that in the Cleveland East congregation. We had an artist named Dan Andreasen, who's quite a successful illustrator even today. And Dan did illustrations for the Plain Truth and for the Good News. And he used local models. And I have magazines here that show my children misbehaving because they were a child rearing series. And Taya's in them, and both our children. I do remember, we were kind of proud of it, and our children, he gave us the pencil sketches, and our children still say they hung pictures in our house of us misbehaving, of stealing cookies and breaking lamps and things like that. You get pictures of your high school graduation. There was a picture of me breaking a lamp on our wall, and I'd never realized the effect that it had on people at that point. And of course, then there was the toilet training article that used a 2-year-old boy in our church, and his mother was so proud of the picture of him sitting on a potty, and she showed it to everybody for years and years and years. And I could mention her name, and you would go, yeah, I kind of remember that, but I will not. I think my absolute favorite was a picture that he painted, and it's kind of Norman Rockwellish, and it has the Masick boy, the cousins in there, and they're in a barber chair. And this was an authentic barber chair in Medina, Ohio. And the one boy's getting a short haircut, and the other boy kind of has a punk haircut, and he's sneering at him. But we would get those, and we'd say, "Oh, they're in our congregation." It was really quite fun. The publications are just as good nowadays, but they're a little different. There's me lecturing my son. Those of you who know my son know that he had white blonde hair, but they decided there were too many blonde boys, and they wanted to reach an international audience, and the man was a painter, so he has black hair in these photos. But it's fun to be able to go back and look at those pictures. I have the Human Potential magazine, which was an incredible effort. All right, it wasn't very good, but it had nice pictures in it. And at the time, it was published by the Ambassador International Cultural Foundation, and it talked about, human beings being all that they could be. It was a very, very important part of our message. So there's archives from those days, and I will leave these up here. There's memorials for Herbert Armstrong. There's an incredible book on the Ambassador Auditorium, which is for sale on eBay now for $25.56. If you want this, I'll sell it to you for $25.55, but not today, because it's the Sabbath. And it's just beautiful. And this building was unbelievable. How many people here have seen the Ambassador Auditorium in Pasadena, California. I've spent a lot of time there. I would go there for 2 services a day because they needed piano players. And they had the most beautiful pianos in the world, literally. I remember Joe, we were talking about literally. Well, they literally had some of the most beautiful pianos you could get. They were Hamburg Steinway grands, and I got to play those every week. They were just wonderful, and in a building that was made with rose onyx and emerald onyx and gold leaf under the stairwells and beautiful acoustics and rosewood panels that you could move if you needed more brightness to the sound in the room. It was just an incredible building. And you know, the funny thing is, there are archives from those days, from what we would call outside sources, from non-church sources. And I spent some time this week looking at those things. And they were very, very eye-opening because they don't show anything about the church's activities, but they show the cultural activities that took place in there from 1974 till I believe the last one was in 1993 or 1994. And of course, all kinds of things happened then that changed the landscape quite a bit. But some of the documentation, and you can look this up. I found a garden blog. This is worth looking up. It's on a site called Pacific Horticulture, and if you type in Pacific Horticulture and Ambassador College, they open up by saying one of Pasadena's most interesting public garden areas, the Ambassador College campus, is also its most endangered, and it talks about how it was dismantled and sold in pieces, and how the auditorium has gone to a group that, frankly, I consider an abomination. I have to be careful what I say because there are such things as libel suits, so I don't want to talk about their activities, but it's not what was had in mind by the people who donated money for that building or by the planners of it. And it's sad to see, but it is good to see that the building still exists and that we're acknowledged for our gardens. And you can look up Ambassador College Gardens, and you will get all kinds of possibilities. And if you've been out there, it's fun to stroll through that. As I said, it tells nothing about the church story. At least 2 of our campuses had wonderful agriculture programs with livestock and crops, and did some research and development of agricultural techniques, and also the students ate very well as a result. There was the freshman 15 pounds that you automatically put on when you went to Ambassador College. And of course, there was music and the arts. And I have found an archive. Well, first of all, I was reading a magazine called Klavier. Klavier is the German word for piano, and there is a magazine called Piano, but it's much classier to have a magazine called Klavier. So Klavier is the classier magazine, and in the back of it, it talked about a concert by a pianist named Arthur Rubinstein. Now, it used to be when you said Arthur Rubinstein, everyone would know who you were talking about, but he died in his 90s a long time ago, and it's okay if you haven't heard of him. But there was only one concert of his that was actually videotaped, and you can still buy a copy of it. It's called The Last Concert for Israel, and it was a benefit concert. It's only available on VHS. I thought about buying a copy because there was one for $4.95, but I don't have a VHS player anymore, and besides, I was there. I remember it. But this was Arthur Rubinstein. At the end, he receives an award from a man who is called 2 things. He's called the founder of the Ambassador Foundation, and he's called patron of the arts. And it's Mr. Herbert Armstrong. He walks up on stage slowly and presents, because they were, I think he was a little younger than Arthur Rubinstein. Arthur Rubinstein called him a young man, I think. But all it said in the magazine was Herbert W. Armstrong, patron of the arts. And I thought to myself, I think he would actually like that. That he's remembered somewhere as patron of the arts. But it's evidence that it existed. One of the most fascinating things that I found is that if you go on eBay and type in Ambassador Auditorium, what you end up with is all the recordings that were done there. And it's world-class artists. It's kind of fun to do that. Another resource that I did not know existed is called the Online Archive of California, which is at Stanford University. And the Online Archive of California, Stanford University, has an Ambassador Auditorium collection. And apparently, I don't know exactly how it happened, but apparently when the auditorium was closed down as a public venue, apparently all the programs and recordings and reel-to-reel tapes of concerts were collected and archived at Stanford University, and it is just incredible. It is like, when you read through the list of names, it's hundreds and hundreds. You know, we come up with 3 or 4 biggies that Luciano Pavarotti sang there, and he did. The Cleveland Orchestra actually played there. They had the Vienna Orchestra there for their inauguration concert, but you name a name and they were there. You know, of course, they were very famous for Bing Crosby performing there because that's where he fell in the orchestra pit, and that was the beginning of the end of Bing Crosby. But there were many other performers. Frank Sinatra performed there, Pearl Bailey, all kinds of people. And when I say all kinds, hundreds and hundreds of names that I recognize. And yes, they've faded out, but it's an archive of music of the end of the 20th century, and it doesn't show a single thing about a church involvement. But it shows how wonderful things were in those days. And I was quite shocked that my own name was on one of the concerts, and it wasn't a church activity. There was a dance reunion with 2 dancers, and I doubt if you've ever heard of them. They were ballet stars in the 1930s and for a few decades after that, and their names were Alicia Markova and Anton Dolan. Actually, they were both born in England, and her name was Alice Marks, and his name was Patrick Kay. But their dance names were Alicia Markova and Anton Dolan. And he was the Rudolf Nureyev of his day. Of course, that's an old name now, too. You might not know what that means. But they were the stars of the dance world, and they had a reunion in their late years. And people from the dance world came from all around the world to see them. And they needed an accompanist who could learn Swan Lake by ear and play it for a young man and woman who were going to dance. And then Anton Dolan and Dame Alicia Markova would coach them and improve them. And they needed a pianist who could turn on a dime, who could stop, start, and go to this section and things like that. And I got tabbed, is that the right word? I got tagged to do it. And my boss said, this is a great job, and you'll be in front of everybody, and this is a wonderful opportunity. And he was the one who pulled the strings for me to get it. Well, what happened was I had been told by Dame Alicia herself that when the spotlight came to the piano that I was to stand and to take a bow, and then I was to leave. And I thought, okay, this sounds real easy. So the spotlight came to me, I stood, and I took a bow, and I left. Well, this was a love fest of dancers, and the spotlights kept going around and around and around. And finally, after, 20 bows of Anton and Alicia, the spotlight went back to the piano to show the young accompanist. And the young accompanist was out in the lobby waiting for his wife to come out. And the spotlight's going around the piano. And Anton Dolan walked over to the bench, and he lifted the lid, and he looked under the piano. Oh, he got his cheap laughs, all right. And afterwards, I'm out in the lobby, and I hear laughter, and I don't know what's going on. But it didn't sound encouraging, and the doors burst open, and my boss came out and yelled. He said, "Do you know what you did?" And it's all archived at Stanford University. I was being sad in the lobby afterwards. Taya was laughing a lot at that point because she knew what had gone on. And this hand grabbed my shoulder and said, "I am the prima ballerina of Hungary, and I am going to teach you to bow." And I said, What? And she says, "You bow like one of those ducks over a glass of water, one of those toys that go like that." She said, "You need help." And she dragged me over to the corner, and with, hundreds of other people in the lobby, I learned how to bow from the prima ballerina of Hungary. And although not every performance of mine has been magnificent since those days, my bows have been without peer, I have to say. And I can still bow, and if you want to learn, I can teach you. But as I said, it was fun to see this recorded as part of our church history. And nowadays I ask myself, did this really happen? By the way, if you want to read the whole story, if you go to Google and type in "How I Learned to Bow," Mark Graham, you get there's a blog post about it. And it was fun in those days. Well, so many things happened, but then the campuses were sold, and even when we were out there, the Thomases were out there. Even when we were out there, you could see that things were not going to last forever. There were undercurrents of things going on. It was right before the receiver came in, if that means anything to you in church history. And eventually, the church fragmented and changed their beliefs. One article I read said with great pride that the first breakaway group was Carl O'Byrne in Cleveland, Ohio. Like, this is something to be proud of, But after that, there were more divisions. And, of course, it's a different kind of era. But I would like to point out to you that just like Noah's Ark, when God preserved things on a ship for a new world, that people have been preserved, that the seeds for that kind of thing have been preserved. And the proof of that is sitting right here in front of me today. I went through the 1993 Cleveland East directory, which I did not bring with me today because it's kind of embarrassing for me. But there's all kinds of people in it. There are still 20 people here today whose smiling face is in that directory. And besides those 1993, I count another 15 people who were around in those days, either in Cleveland East or somewhere else. And you know what? These people are referenced in the book of Haggai, where God says, there were people who saw the former glory, and my Spirit will stay with them. You are the continuity. And anybody listening to this is not just people in Cleveland. God has preserved people. And even though we don't have the trappings and the richness and the campuses, we still have the family of God. And we have our own church culture, and you see it in things like the women's enrichment weekend. And you see it in the prom that we had. You see it in the camps that we have. I'm very happy to be on Facebook. I hear from people, oh, you shouldn't be on Facebook. Facebook's a terrible thing. But Facebook is how I monitor the world. And I say to those people what Jesus Christ said to his disciples when they said, well, then why would anyone get married? And he said, well, some people can handle it and some people can't. And that's the way that I feel about Facebook. And I'm friends with just enough young people and lots of church women so that I get all the photos from all these things, from the camps and from the proms. We had people from Cleveland there. They were just beautiful. It was wonderful to see them, just like I was going to talk about how great the camp program is today, but I don't need to. It's been done. But did you see the camp brochure that came out this year? It is a masterpiece of church literature, Becoming Sons and Daughters of God. And when you open it up, well, the first thing that it talks about after the president's letter is how to become part of God's family. God is a family. If you didn't read this, if you thought, oh, they just want me to donate money for kids to go to camp, well, that is part of it. But you missed a lot. This is good church literature. You could give this to someone who knew nothing about us, or they could watch that video, and you would learn all kinds of things about what God is doing today. I'm very happy about this. This is going in my archives. Let's put it that way. Well, as I said, the book of Haggai is linked to Hebrews 12. So let's turn there now to Hebrews 12. And there is a quotation here, and it's the only time that Haggai is quoted. If we go to verse 12 and go to verse 26, it says, let's start in 25 so we get into the point here. See to it that you do not refuse him who speaks. If they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on earth, how much less will we if we turn away from him who warns us from heaven? At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, and this is the only place where Haggai is quoted in the New Testament, once more I will shake not only the earth and also the heavens. And as if that wasn't enough, he goes on to say the words once more indicate the removing of what can be shaken, that is, created things, so that what cannot be shaken may remain. In other words, this is an end-time prophecy, and that's one of the reasons that it's so important. We are in a bridge time right now. This is not wasted effort. The work is still being done. People are being added to the family. One reason that I very much like the United Church of God and wouldn't think of even going elsewhere is one of the few groups that are poised to go forward just by its very organization, to look at the possibilities and do their best to do them. And I feel that we are doing that. We're in a transition state for having a president of the church at this point. And people have had mixed reactions. They're going, what's going on? Well, I'll tell you what's going on. That's the way our church is set up. We are set up to have a president for a time, and then they move on to a different person. That's the way that our church was organized. And one of the reasons it was done that way was so there wouldn't be too much power in the hands of any one person. And we'd seen how bad that could be in the past. And so when you see that we're having a switch of presidents, that's the right way. That's the way that our laws say, our bylaws say that we do things. So it's a normal, good thing to happen. It'll be adjustment for people, and we'll see some new efforts, but it's actually a good thing, and it shows that people are looking forward. Well, what do we do in this time? Hebrews 12 tells us. If you go to Hebrews 12 and verse 1, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, and he's talking about all the names in chapter 11, talk about nostalgia, he went back to the days of Enoch and Adam to start this list, so he was going back thousands of years. We are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us. Let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. And that's a summary of what the holy days tell us. We'll be immersing ourselves in the Passover, the parts of God's plan that are associated with the Passover soon. And, the other holy days will do the same kind of thing. In chapter 13 of Hebrews, he could be talking about our world right now. He says, keep on loving each other as brothers. That's hard to do these days. More than any other time, it's an exaggeration to say I hate people, but there's a lot of people I'm not crazy about right now. And it's just a sign of the times. There's just friction and meanness and things. But I have to do what this says. Keep on loving each other as brothers and keep on remembering. Like God said to Elijah when he said, I'm the only one. And God says, yeah, you and 7,000 other people who are friends of mine. There are other people. And that's one of the things I was so impressed with that camp video, was all the thinking that's going on in these young minds. And there is great hope. So, 13, keep on loving each other as brothers. Do not forget to entertain strangers. That's something that we haven't done for years now because of this pandemic, and I would like to get back into doing it. Remember those in prison if you were their fellow prisoners, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. Marriage should be honored by all. Wow. Well, that's one of the things that's really disintegrating right now, and yet for us it's an important part of it. Verse 5, keep your lives free from the love of money and be content with what you have. It sounds like the days we live in. Remember your leaders who spoke the word of God to you. Consider the outcome of their way of life. Verse 9, do not be carried away by all kinds of strange teachings. It is good for our hearts to be strengthened by grace. And he goes on into some specific strange teaching, but that's something in 2022 that we really have to work on. So you can read all of these things. And he talks about obey your leaders and submit to their authority. They keep watch over you as men who must give an account. And then in verse 20, he starts to close with, may the God of peace, who through the blood of eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, equip you with everything good for doing his will. And may he work in us what is pleasing to him through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. And how does he do that? Let's turn back to the Book of Festus. The Book of Festus, chapter 2. God told us how he was doing it. He says in verse 4 of chapter 2, but now be strong, people, declares the Lord, and work, for I am with you. There is much to do. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit remains among you. Do not fear. And this is what the author of Hebrews is talking about. We are girded with God's Spirit for this time. There's a quote from Wayne Gretzky that I quote a lot, and you know it, and it's a cliche, but wow, is it a good quote. Wayne Gretzky, of course, was, when you say he was a hockey player, that doesn't begin to tell the story. If you take Wayne Gretzky's statistics and cut them in half, he's still one of the top 5 hockey players ever to play. And Wayne Gretzky says, I skate to where the puck is going, not to where it's been. And that's what we need to do. A good hockey player plays where the puck is. A great hockey player plays where the puck is going to be. Well, we could say a good child of God works with God where he is, but a great child of God thinks about where God is going to be. And the past helps us do that. Let's read that verse in Festus again, in chapter 2 and verse 5. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you. Do not fear.